Where did the writers get the material? Well, first of all, from memory, as in, not necessarily that the people writing the Gospels were there with Jesus, but some people were, and there was a memory of what Jesus is supposed to have said and done and what happened to him. So there is this corporate memory amongst the early Christians. And one of the most creative areas of modern gospel scholarship is actually what's called memory research. How do ancient communities, or how do any communities, remember stuff? And in particular, how do traditional pre-literate societies remember stuff? And what's the process for that happening when we can't just Google it or look it up in our Bible or whatever? So we have to assume that some of the general laws of oral tradition and remembering things are going to have been at play. And we can see that sometimes in the Gospels. If you go through some of the sayings of Jesus, they're collected together because of common words. A whole lot of sayings about salt, because remember there were 3 things about salt, or there were 5 things about this. And because most of us have 5 fingers and so on, that's another useful trick, is to develop things into sets. Remember the 5 rules about this, remember the 12 or the 10 or whatever it happens to be. However, at some point, these documents, these traditions begin to coalesce. And around about the early part of the 2nd century, people like Ignatius of Antioch, southern Turkey again, is highly suspicious of documents like Gospels, which is interesting, because he says documents can be falsified. The only thing he's interested in is the oral tradition and the sayings of the Lord. So even as late as 100, the idea that if you wanted to learn about Jesus, you'd go to a gospel or you go to a document, was not thoroughly kind of kosher in a sense. There's still the oral tradition, but it's beginning to turn into text. And as far as we can tell, the earliest expression of that is Mark, in terms of a gospel that exists in its own right, a document that exists in its own right. But it's also quite likely that parallel to Mark, and even a little bit earlier than Mark, there's a collection of Jesus' sayings, which are not particularly found in Mark. Mark is more the action man, Jesus doing stuff. And we know from Matthew and Luke that there was a whole body of other material about Jesus, which is mostly parables and teaching moments, pronouncement stories and all the rest. Now that tradition, that gathering of the teaching material, is sometimes identified with what we call Q, which is just a symbol for the German word Quelle, meaning source. So we just say, well, there was some other source. One of the interesting questions is, so what happens to Q? Is Q, in effect, the first iteration of what became the Gospel of Luke? So while the Gospel of Luke might not have been finished until much later, as with Mark and Matthew, and as with the Gospel of John, maybe the Gospel of Luke actually has layers, some of which have their roots way, way back, maybe even in the 40s and 50s of the Common Era. And that this tradition, which we call Q, kind of spiraled its way through history for 100 years or so. Along the way, it gets used by Matthew when he's doing a revised, enlarged edition of Mark. Effectively what he does is say, well, Mark's good, but Mark plus this stuff is even better. So Matthew is really integrating the collected wisdom of Jesus into the story of what Jesus did. And so then Mark becomes Matthew. Meanwhile, that stuff continues to roll on and is probably what Marcion circulates as the gospel. It's simply the Q gospel material beginning to develop and not yet turning into the Gospel of Luke. And then in response to Marcion, then Luke, the Gospel of Luke, comes out in a slightly more, in a way which will emphasize the theological themes which are now important for orthodoxy. So Luke is dripping with echoes of the Old Testament, because he wanted to make the point, we're not going to throw the Old Testament out. So Luke chapter 1 and 2 could easily come out of 1 Samuel or 2 Samuel or the book of Judges. They're very much breathing the kind of culture and the spirituality of Judges and Samuel and so on. So Q is perhaps a collection of oral tradition. John doesn't seem to have made much use of it. The Gospel of John had other ways of developing its material, but Mark has been pulling together stories about what Jesus did. Some other communities have been remembering what Jesus said. Matthew has pulled that plus Mark together, and Luke represents perhaps the final development of the Q tradition into a standalone gospel. Although, of course, for Luke, the gospel goes on to the book of Acts, which makes it a very different gospel because it's only part one of a two-part story.